Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Scully, a contributing editor at The Hill, and thank you for joining us for our program titled Reimagining the Pharma Supply Chain. In today's program, we will talk about drug shortages and the strains on the pharmaceutical supply chains. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pfizer, for supporting today's important conversation. The pandemic has exposed our country's dependence on other countries for essential prescription drugs. This threatens the security of the supply chain, and it leads to shortages of essential prescription drugs like amoxicillin and Adderall. So how do we ensure our healthcare manufacturing practices and supply chains are sustainable and able to reach the demand? What did we learn from the manufacturing infrastructure around COVID and the COVID-19 vaccine? Is the supply chain crisis a wake-up call to transform, to reimagine, and to rebuild new pharma supply chain models? Our program today hopes to answer those questions and much more. Now, you can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillSupplyChain. My first guest is Congressman Buddy Carter. He is a pharmacist for over 30 years. Congressman Carter is also co-sponsor of the Made in America Act. This is legislation that works to mitigate drug shortages while incentivizing the domestic manufacturing of drugs. Congressman, thank you for being with us. And I want to begin on one of the looming questions that we have been talking about, which is why so many pharmaceutical supplies are coming from foreign countries.
Well, over the years, first of all, let me say that I think that there's a big difference between knowing something and realizing something. We've always known that this was a problem, that too many of our pharmaceuticals are coming from other countries, but we realized it during the pandemic. And we realized that what happened was that a lot of the pharmaceutical manufacturers, for numerous reasons, not the least of which was labor costs, moved their manufacturing facilities overseas. And we experienced that during the pandemic. We experienced it in a number of ways because we had a shortage in medications. And not only medications, but also PPE and also a number of different things related to the pandemic. In fact, the ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Emergency Response, he told us in the Doctors Caucus that in the fall of 2019, they noticed a downtick in the amount of PPE that was coming from China. Now, we didn't even know about the pandemic until the spring or February of 2020. They knew what was going on then, and they started withholding the amount of PPE that they were sending to us. That should send a strong message to us right there of the importance of having either our manufacturing taking place here in America, or at least having our allies have the ability to manufacture prescription drugs so that we are not held hostage by our adversaries and depend on them for our PPE, for our pharmaceuticals, and for the things that we're going to need during a pandemic.
You come to this conversation really with two different but important perspectives: as a lawmaker, a member of Congress, but also as the owner of your own pharmacy for 3+ decades. So wearing that hat, what did you learn over the years? What were your biggest frustrations, and how do you apply that to Congress today?
Well, what I learned during that time, of course, was that we often had supply chain issues. Now, there were supply chain issues, and in fact, you can go to today. We're having a problem with amoxicillin, and it's not necessarily the manufacturing of the drug and it being manufactured overseas, but we've had an increase in RSV, we've had an increase in the number of ear infections during this time, and that has caught the pharmaceutical manufacturers off guard, and they're not prepared for it, and therefore we're having a shortage of that. That's why I've introduced legislation to deal with this. Two pieces of legislation. First of all, again, what we experienced during the pandemic was the supply chain issues and a shortage of certain medications. What we need to do is to complement and supplement the federal stockpiles by encouraging the states to have their own stockpiles. That's why I've introduced legislation, the State Stockpile Readiness Act, that will have grants that will match dollar for dollar for states that actually have their own and generate their own stockpiles. Also, we need to include the private sector to make sure that they are helping us. That's why I've got another piece of legislation, the Essential Medicine Stockpile Act, that will help these and encourage the manufacturers to use the private sector to have these stockpiles, particularly of generic drugs, so that if we do have a problem like we're experiencing right now in the amoxicillin, that we can address that problem.
I'm curious, though, 2.5, almost 3 years into this COVID-19 pandemic, it really did show some of the divisions and the weaknesses that we have in our supply chain. So what did we learn about that, and how do you apply those lessons moving forward?
What we learned, first of all, if you'll take, for example, China and India, those two countries are where most of the pharmaceuticals come from right now. India withheld 26 drugs, 26 essential drugs during the pandemic that we could have used, but they were hoarding those drugs in order to make sure they had them for their country. Now, nobody can really blame them for that, but at the same time, that puts us in a predicament where we don't have access to those drugs. That's why I've introduced the Made in America Act. And what that does is it stands for manufacturing active pharmaceutical ingredients, drugs, and excipients in America. And what we're trying to do is to repatronize those companies, those pharmaceutical manufacturers, to come back to America using the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the opportunity zones that we created in that act, using that will give them a 30% incentive, a 30% tax credit. In order, if they use the opportunity zones where you have the federal poverty level is at 30% or more, then they can use that and they can actually get the discount. That's going to be incentive for them to bring manufacturing back to America. And that's what we need. You know, it's bad enough that we weren't prepared during this pandemic, but shame on us if we're not prepared the next time, because we've learned some important lessons during this pandemic.
Because that is something that we are hearing from health officials, public health experts, is that there will be another type of pandemic. We just don't know if and when that happens. Can you, though, point to states that are doing it right, this public-private partnership that involves the federal government, but also state tax credits?
Well, again, this is a pilot project that we're starting with the State Stockpile Act, but even in my home state of Georgia, we've done this before. I remember when I was in the state legislature and we had the outbreak of the bird flu, we actually encouraged a stockpile of certain antibiotics in case that we had more of an outbreak of the bird flu. And we were prepared for that. So there have been some states that have utilized this and have made preparation in order to be prepared and in order to have a stockpile so that if something does happen, then they're ready for it. They can respond to it.
And as you look at some of these issues, we're now in the cold and flu season. A lot of these drugs are respiratory illness medications, and there is a real severe shortage of these drugs. Why?
Well, again, I think it's just a lack of preparedness, and that's why we've got to stress it, and that's why we've got to encourage these states and the manufacturers. This needs to be a private-public partnership here. We need to work with the manufacturers, with the private sector, to make sure that we are prepared and that we have an ample supply in order to address this situation. I can only imagine a parent not being able to get an antibiotic for their child. That would be awful because it's not available. That's why we've got to be better prepared, and that's why I've introduced these pieces of legislation that will encourage these stockpiles and also encourage us to be able to manufacture those drugs here so that we're not dependent on especially adversarial countries for our pharmaceutical needs or for our PPE needs.
So as the now former owner of Carter's Pharmacy, but when customers came into your drugstore asking for these very specific medications, you didn't have them. How did you explain it to them?
Well, it's difficult to explain. First of all, we made every effort that we could to find it for them, calling other pharmacies and seeing where we could help them with that. And then, the next option that you have is to look for something else that might not be as effective, but hopefully will help. And we were able to we were able to handle most situations, but it is a very uneasy feeling to tell a parent of a child that you don't have access to medications in the most advanced country in the world. And that's just inexcusable, to be quite honest with you.
And I'm curious, what's the role of some of these large manufacturing chains? How are they involved in some of these supply chain issues that we've been talking about?
Well, they have a big role. And that brings up a great point. And that's a great question that you've asked here, because what we are finding out, particularly on the Energy and Commerce Committee and on the Health Subcommittee, is that we're not having a whole lot of research and development in certain sectors of, in certain areas, if you will, of medicine. For instance, in antibiotics, because it's not very profitable now for pharmaceutical manufacturers to invest in antibiotics. We're not seeing a lot of new antibiotics come to market. We've got to address that in Congress, and we've got to encourage these companies or incentivize them to invest in these areas that we need them to invest in too, such as antibiotics. You know, they all want to look at other areas, and that's great. We want them to be looking at where it's more profitable. You know, look, it's a capitalist system, and they're looking to make profit, and we understand that. But we can't be caught with our pants down, if you will, and not have the antibiotics available for when the next big bug comes out.
You mentioned international cooperation. India is soon to become the world's most populous nation. We've had issues with China, a rather lengthy meeting in November between President Biden and Xi Jinping to try to foster that cooperation. On this specific area, whether it's India, China, or other countries, how are we doing that, and where can we do better?
Well, where we can do better is to have more manufacturing here in America. You know, we used to have quite a few pharmaceutical manufacturers in Puerto Rico, but because of some problems over there, they left Puerto Rico, went over to Europe. And again, not the least of which is labor and the price of labor. But we've got to make sure that we are creating a fertile environment for pharmaceutical manufacturers to invest in America and to manufacture in America. And we got to, and that to me is the role of government. You know, we have to create an environment in which these companies want to be in America. And that's what our responsibility is.
So why is that so hard? Is this simply about profits for the drug manufacturers? Why is it hard to make these drugs here in the U.S.?
Well, it's certainly not hard as far as you know, having the facilities or the knowledge and the ability to do it, but it is a market-driven market, and you know, it's and the incentive is profit, and they, if they can be more profitable overseas, then obviously they're going to move overseas. These are companies that you know, are practicing capitalism, so we've got to be more competitive. That's why, again, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the opportunity zones that were created in that's a real good opportunity for these companies to take advantage. And it's win-win for all of us, because it'll be investing in areas here in America we need them to invest in, where they have low poverty rates, and then we'll be incentivizing them with a less tax rate and a tax benefit.
Congressman Carter, is this one of those issues that really cuts across partisan lines? Are you getting Democratic support?
Absolutely. In fact, we've started a caucus that is addressing this, and it's extremely important. Listen, I tell people all the time, I practiced pharmacy for almost 40 years, and I never had an opportunity, or never had a situation, I should say, where I went to the counter and I said, "Are you a Republican or a Democrat?" I mean, it was just, you know, my child's sick, or I need this medication. Partisan politics has nothing to do with this. That's why we are working in a bipartisan fashion to address this. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, if you need that medication, you need that medication. It needs to be available for you.
And so, final point, as you look at this Made in America Act, what are your metrics of success? If we were to talk a year or 2 years from now, what would you point to?
I would look at it as how dependent are we on foreign countries, as opposed to, at that time, as opposed to where we are now. We know that, 80% of all the antibiotics are coming from overseas. 80% of the ibuprofen is coming from overseas. Well, if we can change that and reverse that course, and we've got more manufacturing here in America, then we'll know that we've been successful.
And the biggest supply chain concerns you have are what?
One of the biggest supply chain issues that and concerns that I have is with the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, because this is the base formulation, if you will, that you need in order to make these drugs. And if we don't have the active pharmaceutical ingredients in order to formulate these drugs, in order to compound these drugs, then we're going to be in trouble. So that's one area that we really need to concentrate on, is to have more of the APIs manufactured here in America.
And how will this issue play out, final question, in the new Congress? Republicans will have control of the House, Democrats will have control of the Senate. What are you looking at?
Well, we are working, as I say, in a bipartisan fashion with the new caucus that we have put together, and we're working together on that. I'm not certain that it's as much of an issue that's dependent on Republican, Democrat, who's in charge, as much as it is the important lessons that we have learned during the pandemic. And us coming together, and as we do oversight on what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what did we learn during the pandemic, as we start to address those questions, then we work together to address that and come up with solutions.
Congressman Buddy Carter is a co-sponsor of the Made in America Act. He's also a former pharmacist, a member of Congress from Georgia, and a member of a couple of key committees looking into this legislation, supporting this bill. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you.